Hello friends, today I am going to be creating a very colorful, very vibrant mixed media painting, and I started off by just using a rubber brayer with some white paint and going over a layer of black paint that I had already put on this canvas. So I'm mixing together some different colors on the side over there on my palette, which is a white, a coral, an Indian yellow, and a rose pink, and just sort of making a really grungy background with a palette knife. Lately I've been suffering from a little bit of artist block, and I feel like it's one of those things that is usually solved by just throwing some colors at a canvas and not really having a whole lot of planning or direction, because to be honest with you, coming up with plans for art lately has been a little bit challenging, and I think that a lot of it has to do with living in the Northeast in winter and the lack of inspiration and color that's kind of around me. So I decided to kind of make my own colorful painting regardless of what was going on in the outdoors. And the best way for me to do that is just to get all the colors that I don't see and put them on a canvas together and just see what happens. One of the reasons why I chose to use a palette knife in order to get color on the canvas in the first place is because I did want to have a grungy effect. And man, I was a teenager in the 90s and grunge was all the rage, so it is something that I quite enjoy, that aesthetic, and I love that when you use a palette knife you can just kind of create these really cool kind of abstract gradients, and it just creates such a great effect. You can tell though that I'm longing for spring colors, because right now it looks sort of like an Easter egg. One of the reasons why I take newspaper and I press it down onto the painting after I use a palette knife is because it keeps all of the textures, but you don't have the big globs of paint, so it aids in the drying process. And now I decided that I was going to add some of this neon pink, and that's a Liquitex Basics neon pink. And somewhere in here I was like, that is way too pink. My goodness, that is so neon. And it seemed like a good idea at the time, but I really needed to mute it down. And you know, you make these decisions and you kind of cover them up here and there, or you mix paint in, and the paint is still wet, so it actually mixes really well because you're putting relatively thick layers of paint onto the canvas as you go. So it didn't destroy anything. It just was like, oh well, that was a little too vibrant for my liking. And then just kind of going over the dried painting with a little bit more of that palette knife and taking off that excess paint again, so it creates a really cool effect. At this point I decided that I did want to put in a little bit of collage, and New York Post is one of the best places to find large headlines. So these are parts that I had clipped out of the newspaper, and I thought, oh, you know, these are pretty positive messages, so I'll put these in here and see how it looks. And it still is beginning to look more like a grungy kind of pop art canvas so far. It actually would have made a pretty good just abstract painting, I think, without me adding anything else to it, any other imagery. But what ended up, of course, happening is that I did want to paint a zebra. So I relate to zebras, kind of feel like you fit in with your own crowd, all the stripy ones with the wild mohawks, you know. So in order to get the collage a little bit more integrated into the painting, I didn't want it to just look like it was stuck on, so I took some more paint and I decided that I would just like kind of block in the edges so it didn't just look like paper stuck onto the canvas. And then after that I took a sponge brush, dipped in a little bit of water so that you could still read the words, and it would just look like it was misted over somewhat. And that created kind of a cool effect. At this point I decided that I wanted to add some just abstract mark making. So I mixed a little bit of primary red and that fluorescent pink, and it made this really nice pink, which I thought was just way better than straight up fluorescent pink. And so after adding those lines, I was like, okay, well, I'll add in a little bit more black and make some line work that way and just keep it kind of grungy and fill in the edges. The rubber brayer, I do love using the rubber brayer because you can just get some really cool marks on your canvas just by adding a little bit of paint to the brayer and just seeing where it goes. So, you know, using tape, using palette knife, creating some more lines here and there. Of course, when you use a palette knife, you have to just like wait for everything to dry somewhat before you can tape over it, but that's okay. It's a process. And I still really wasn't too crazy about this edge on the right hand side, so I started just mixing a little bit of the primary red again, and that seemed a little bit too dark, so I ended up putting a little bit of pink over it, and it was really kind of a funny way of, this is like this intuitive kind of abstract layering process that is really fun to do, because whatever you don't like, you can pretty much cover up. You don't have to keep everything on there. But just to create a really colorful background and add some paint splatter, which I did with the high flow titanium white acrylic and a splatter tool. And then once again, I used the paper to kind of just take off the excess paint. I tend to save my caps. This is a vitamin cap, but I have a tendency to hoard caps so that I can make circles on canvases, especially for just some abstract designs. And, you know, it creates kind of a neat effect. I also use solid paint markers by Sakura in order to do some mark making. So I found this really cool reference photo on unsplash.com, and I believe the photographer is Nick Lamon, and I just thought this was such a cool profile picture of a zebra. So once I transferred my zebra onto my canvas after it had completely dried, I started putting in the black lines with some Mars black acrylic paint. So I wanted the zebra to be sort of integrated with the background. So in order to do that, I decided that I would make some transparent stripes that kind of picked up the pink colors that were in the background, but still gave the impression of there being darker stripes. So I mixed together some of the Liquitex permanent red. I also added in a little bit of the Indian yellow to get more of an orangey color in some areas, and I used some of the fluorescent pink and just used water in order to get it nice and transparent, more like a watercolor effect. If you look at the nose in the reference photo, there's a lot of brown in that area, so I mixed together a little bit of burnt umber and yellow ochre and then used the black in the darker part of the shadows. And for the actual outline of the nostril, I used a little bit of yellow ochre diluted with water, and even though yellow ochre is a pretty opaque color, if you dilute it with water it makes it semi-opaque, so that really just kind of worked for that lighter area. At this point in time, I decided that I needed to add another color, and I still wanted this to have a really bright kind of poppy effect. So the bright aqua green was a really good choice because it complements all of the pinks in the painting, but I also thought that it would just be another great color to add to this because it's one of my favorite colors actually. So I went about outlining the face of the zebra first so that I could go in with a rubber brayer afterward and then just kind of still maintain this grungy effect without covering everything that was underneath it. because I really did like the colors that I had already established on the canvas. So covering them all up would seem kind of, I don't know. I just didn't want to get rid of them all. Like all paintings, I feel like paintings go through a really messy phase until they all start to come together. And when this painting really started to come together for me is when I started adding all of the white stripes. It added exactly the right amount of contrast, and I started to see what the painting was actually going to become and the potential for the painting. So the white stripes made all of the difference in the world. And by the way, if you'd like to see the full-length video of this painting being created, head over to my Patreon, where I have lots of extra free content, as well as full-length tutorials on how I create some of my mixed media paintings. So that's a consideration, and I'll put a link in the description. All right, so you see how these stripes are really making all of the difference in the world, and I absolutely loved this painting after I put these stripes in. I can't tell you that I was a little bit concerned earlier in the painting. I mean, things, when you do kind of these intuitive backgrounds and everything, you really never know how they're going to turn out, and I had not planned on putting the bright aqua green in the painting, but once I did, I was like, oh, okay. This is actually starting to become something. But the moment that I put the actual white stripes on the zebra's face, I was like, oh yeah, here it is. It's coming. It's becoming something. I decided to use some of the Montana water-based spray paint and add a couple of stencils here and there just to create some patterns and some interest in a couple of the corners. And so I switched the colors and used this kind of the bright aqua green on one side and then used the pink on the other to kind of balance it out a little bit. And then I kind of thought that my little friend's mohawk was a little bit too close to the color of the background. There was a little too much pink. So I took a Posca marker that was this kind of aqua greenish blue color and did an outline to make it even more poppy. And I think that it really kind of added something to it, and it created a little bit of that separation. It only make it like the neon zebra. I think that was a pretty cool idea. So the right hand corner really needed something else, and so I decided to add a couple of numbers to really kind of just amp up that grunge appeal, and then the painting was pretty much finished. And I'm really happy with the way that it turns out. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you liked it, please hit the like button. Please subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, and I love you guys. I'll see you next time.